So this presentation is going to be about the iCub. We cover some of the historical aspects, and then we go through the recent results on the robot. The iCub project is something that started 10 years ago. It's about human robotics, and in particular it's about building models that can be implemented on the robot, and these are models of cognitive behaviors. So there's a dual goal in the project. One is understanding how the brain may be solving certain problems, so taking inspiration from nature, and this has been historically very prominent in human robotics, so we're taking a similar approach. And the other reason for doing this is that these models can allow the construction of better robots that are smarter, more intelligent than usual, and they can solve some of the problems autonomously. So there's a particular element that I'd like to discuss, and this is represented in this slide. So it's called the frontoparietal system, and this is has been the source of inspiration also because since the beginning in this project we had a collaboration with neurophysiologists, and they've been telling us stories about how certain neurons and population of neurons interact, and they determine certain behaviors in the brain. And in particular, they identified these two, let's say, big areas which are strongly interconnected, and these systems have to do with the control of movement, with grasping, with understanding of objects, and so forth. So for us, it's basically all we wanted to do in human robotics projected onto what the brain is doing. So in particular, the history goes that a certain point, about 20 years ago, these neurophysiologists discovered a very peculiar type of neurons that later were called mirror neurons. And these were very inspirational to robotics also, because for the first time they kind of showed that when you do action recognition, you're not only processing the visual data, or better, you input is visual data, but you're always sort of remembering what was the motor act that generated the same visual data. And this was important because in let's say in robotics and computer vision, the typical approach was, okay, let's consider a sequence of images, let's do some analysis, but we don't know anything about the specific, let's say, kinematics, movement, activation of motor areas that are connected to the execution of that particular act. So instead, this view changed a bit since the discovery of the mirror neurons, because it was sort of telling us that the embodiment of the robot was particularly important. And so we came out with this idea of using motor signals during the training of machine learning methods applied to the particular task of action recognition. This is basically, initially we started from results that came directly from neuroscience. This is an example of a particular neuron. What we can see here is that the neuron is active when a person is actually executing an action. It's a grasping action, but when the monkey, in this case, is executing the same action. And there's sort of congruence between the action executed by the person and the action executed by the monkey gives the name basically to mirror neurons, because the two situations are like mirror to each other. Now, this is kind of nice behavior because if we had a processing unit in the robot that can just look at the images and tell us, oh, the person is doing this, then we can build other behaviors like we can imitate the action, we can understand what the person is doing, we can understand gestures and so forth. So this was kind of the starting point for us. Now, since we were discussing things with these neurophysiologists, we came with sort of a cartoon-like explanation of how the brain may be doing this. And the idea goes that basically you decide to do an action, you in the sense here, maybe the monkey or whatever. This action is represented in certain areas in the brain, activates a number of motor primitives that eventually generate the movement. Now this is expected to be observed by the person that is executing it, because if you have to control the movement and sort of judge whether you're doing right or wrong, you need to have a sensory feedback. The sensory feedback has to be compared with the original action that you intended to generate, so if there's a discrepancy, you correct for the discrepancy. And so you need to map this sensory data into motor data again, because this is a motoric area. So what happens in the brain, or what we hypothesized, is that when you're in this situation where another person is just observing the action but is not generating any movement, you activate the same circuit, and the same circuit is used basically as a recognition circuit, neural circuit. So it's basically lighting up, or the neurons are activated to judge or to recognize the action that has been observed, as if the person was actually going to execute the action, but the action is not executed. So this is just an observation. So we said, why don't we try to do this on the robots? Because I mean, this will be very powerful, and also it's very different from what people have been doing in computer vision again. So one thing that we've done as a first experiment was to in fact sort of distinguish between a standard experiment where we have vision and then we just build a classifier, which means you have visual data, a sequence of images, you build a classifier. This can be done using machine learning methods, and we try to sort of determine what is the action, here G is for gesture, that is executed by the person. Or we have an alternative here suggested by the neurophysiology, which is take vision, we first transform everything into a motor format, M here is for motoric data, and then we build a classification. And this resembles what we believe is happening in the brain. Now if you do this, at that time, this is an experiment that is 10 years old, so the robot wasn't done yet. So what we done was to ask a number of students to behave like robots, in the sense that we use sensors to grab the kinematics and the movements that were generated by them. And in particular, these are, so they wear a data glove, a tracker, so we knew at each instant of time what was happening. We had also images. And then we decided to classify these images, basically. And you can see there are various grasping actions, exactly as they were observing the monkey, and a number of different objects, small, large, etc. And we built an experiment where we basically took these images, we mapped into a motoric representation. The motoric representation was available because it was recorded through a data glove from the people executing the actions. And then we built the, as I say, the classification. This we employed a particular formalism that is Bayesian, in the form of the Bayesian classifier, which has a nice property that we can identify the objects that are to be grasped, so we can give priors to the classification. So if we know that a large object can only be grasped by a full power grasp, then this information can be thrown into the system, which is very natural also from what the neurophysiology tells us. And then we run the experiment, and the experiment goes, or the experiment sort of demonstrated that we achieve a much better generalization ability by this transformation into the motor system. Basically, what happens, or at least what is our understanding, is that by doing the mapping, you simplify the life of the classifier, and also I think it's important that the motoric data is more invariant. So vision changes a lot if you change the point of view, and these images were taken from different points of view, while the motoric data is always the motoric data, so it's more constant. So it's like a good frame of reference from where to build the classifier. So this was sort of the basic initial idea, and as I said, this is an old experiment. Another important aspect, or let's say fact, that has been sort of described by the neurophysiology is it's always similar brain areas, and it has to do with the recognition of objects. So again, while in the past, and that's certainly true, it was shown that we recognize the identity of the various objects. It's also true that when we see a shape, we don't need to recognize the object. If we just have to, let's say, grasp it, we may have a brain area that just sort of elaborates the information that is needed for grasping. This has been observed in patients that had like strokes in different places in the brain, whereby, for instance, they observe patients that cannot recognize objects, but if you ask them to grasp them, they're perfect at grasping. So they know exactly the shape, although they cannot tell what it is. So they're shown different objects, they do perfectly well, but they don't know what they're grasping, basically. That's what happens in this case. And here there's a family of neurons, in fact, they're called canonical neurons, that respond to the shape of the object. Like this neuron responds to the ring, but doesn't respond to the cylinder. This is a sort of the activation of the neuron following the observation of the ring. And if you show a cylinder, nothing happens, or almost nothing happens. These two, just to basically say that if you show an object to the robot or to the monkey, there's an activation that is specific to the shape, and this is like a preparation to the action. So this activation sort of prepares the actual action to grasp the object. So we try to do something similar on the robot. Again, we had to sort of simplify things because with the robots it's a lot more difficult. So what we done was the following. You see the videos here. So the robot, instead of grasping the objects, that is a lot more complicated and requires a lot more sort of work, it's just touching the objects. And so the action is no longer whether the robot can grasp, but is how the robot can push an object. So like this object here is traveling this way. So what we measure is if I touch an object, what happens? Does it move? How it moves? And these plots here show that if you take the toy car, like in here, the toy car will tend to have a very peculiar way of moving. And in particular, if you look at this number here, is the angle with respect to the orientation of the car. And so what happens is that if you push the car with an angle that is 0, which means along the direction of the wheels, the car will travel the farthest, because it's like shown here. Like if you push a car sideways, it doesn't move much, because of course, I mean, that's intuitive, but for the robot doesn't know anything, it's nice that it can actually explore the object and learn this property. And the opposite with this object, because this object will tend to travel along different directions because it rolls in a different way. And if you take a ball, the ball doesn't have any preference in a sense, because whatever you do, the ball will roll. And so what we done with this was to start showing an object to the robot, and the robot was asked to actually push it in a certain way. So this to say that what happens here is that the object and the action that is associated with the object are put together, and this is similar to what we saw in the brain. The shape of the object and the action you can make are put together. So this is a very similar thing. Just to simplify, we had to use simple toys. We cannot do grasping, which is a bit more complicated. Now, we said, okay, but let's see whether we can learn more, because objects, okay, you can push the objects, but certain objects are useful for other things. And in particular, you see here the robot is using a stick to push an object that maybe is too far away. So what we done was another experiment where the robot is actually learning about the size of the objects, so they can use them to push another object. So it's kind of moving towards the use of tools rather than just seeing the object and grasping them. It's a bit more complicated, but it's useful because it starts building complex interactions, physical interaction between the objects. And this is an example with various tools, and the plots here show, for instance, that if you use the rake, it's better to pull an object from the back, so that if you have to pull, you have maximized the chances of the object getting closer to you. If you try to use these, it's not very effective at pulling, because it's it's an object that doesn't have a hook to actually get the object closer. So, and the images here show the real-time image processing that is required to understand where is the object and what is the object length. And for each of these objects, we repeat the same type of exploration so that the robot can learn the size of the object. Now, and so you understand now why this video is using the tool and using this object. This has been explored separately, and the tool has been also explored. You put this information together, you can build this behavior. And so what we said was, why don't we, let's see, build an experiment where the robot has an object that is far away and decides which tool to use to actually pull the object closer and then to grasp it. This is a video that shows what happens. So in this case, this is far away, so the robot goes towards the tool, recognizes there's a tool available, and he knows about this tool because I explored it before. And so then he uses it to pull the object closer. Which I think, I mean, it's nice. I mean, monkeys do this, so they use sticks to find the ants, for instance. That has been observed in nature quite a lot. So it's a very first step of, let's say, cognition or reasoning using objects. It requires a number of abilities that we're now able to simulate on the robot. And I think this sort of, let's say, for the future, tells us what can be a possible route to the use of objects to achieve more complex behaviors. So this is one aspect. Now there are a number of elements that you need to know about this video. For instance, you need to recognize the objects. That's not given for granted. I mean, the robot has to be able to use images to recognize objects. And this is some piece of work that we've done in this direction. So what you see in the video here is the robot that sees an object in the hand and is being asked to recognize the object. And you see that observes the object and is given a name to the object. And so when the object is observed again, the robot knows the name of the object and can distinguish the object from other objects. And this is one of the, let's say, elements or the building blocks for the videos that we just shown earlier. So if you have to decide what tool to use, you have to recognize the tools, for instance. And this, well, it's a long video that shows a number of objects and the ability of the robot to actually recognize the various objects. It says here, just recognize these to be a toy. Now this one will say, just recognize to be a box, just recognize box, and so forth. So to show that we can do that in real time, and so the robot sees the scene, sees objects, and recognizes them. So this is one thing. This is the same example. I like this one because it shows, for instance, that the robot always tells you, a certain answer. So it believes this to be a bottle, which is right, and but also you show a different bottle, and it will tell you this is a bottle. And I think this is important because it's a kind of difficult to achieve, because they, I mean, it's really not easy to take a class of objects and merge them into a single concept, which is what's happening here. This is another piece of work that is needed. You saw the robot grasping objects from the table. So this is the operations that are needed. In this case, we do a 3D reconstruction of the object, and we use the 3D information to decide how to grasp it. Of course, I mean, there's a bit of theory behind it, but what I wanted to show is that this works, and so it's, now we can move into the grasping experiments. This is kind of just finished, so it's not that we've done everything, but we at least have, or can show, that the robot can just look at the object and decide how to grasp it, and it's kind of successful most of the time. Now all this, how we put it together, how does it fit in a sense? I just wanted to show you what happens in reality. I mean, these are nice laboratory scenes, but why the research is taking so long. The reality is this one. If you Google for something like make a sandwich. This can be a task for the robot, right? You ask the robot to look at the ingredients, put things together, make a nice sandwich. Okay, but look at these images. They're really cluttered. There's a lot of distractors. I mean, the robot will have a very hard life in distinguishing objects here. Look at these. There's a tool use. This again, a tool to reach something far, like in this case. There's the ingredients, ingredients. So the object recognition here that's happening, and there's action generation. So common actions to put things together. Now, this is something we're doing, and this is basically shown here. The actions, these are, I didn't enter much into the details here. These are experiments that have been done with the iCub in teaching new actions, like putting something into a container. This can be the basic building blocks if you have to make a sandwich, like in the previous case, you have to know that you put the bread from here to here and so forth. Then you have objects, and this is what we've seen before, so recognizing them and learning their properties. And then we have tools, how to use a tool to get certain job done. So this basically what puts everything together. The message is that we started a long time ago from observing nature. We ended up here understanding what are the basic blocks that can make a complex behavior on the robots. And this is basically the entire story I wanted to tell. These are acknowledgements. We've been funded by IIT, where I work, of course, but also through external funding from the European Commission. Thank you. Happy birthday to the International Journal of Advanced Robotic Systems.